It started with something so small, I'm not even sure it qualifies as a beginning. A glance, that's all. One of those moments that shouldn't mean anything. And yet, when I replay it now, it's the first crack in the glass. We had gathered at my mother's house to celebrate her birthday. The house was warm, loud with the clinking of dishes, the overlapping voices of family. My husband was sitting on the terrace with a glass of wine, talking to my cousin about interest rates. I was inside, helping with the dessert, wiping my hands, on a linen towel that smelled faintly of oregano. I remember that smell vividly. It always lingers in my mother's kitchen. He stood near the sink, drying plates. My stepfather, the man who had been part of my life since I was 15. We'd never been close, not distant, not hostile, just neutral. He had always been respectful, quiet, measured, the kind of man you don't think about twice. Until that night. I turned to hand him a plate, and he took it from me, fingers grazing mine just slightly too long. His eyes lifted, calm and steady, and I saw it. That moment, a look that felt like a question I hadn't been asked in decades. I didn't look away. That glance followed me for the rest of the evening like static under my skin. I poured drinks, smiled in group photos, laughed too quickly at my husband's dry jokes. But I kept feeling it, that pause in the kitchen. I couldn't shake it, couldn't rationalize it into nothing. After dinner, we gathered on the porch. The sky had shifted to that deep, inky blue that only appears after a humid spring day. My mother brought out an old photo album, the one with thick plastic pages and yellowed corners. I sat beside my husband, but I couldn't stop my eyes from drifting. He stood behind the group, arms crossed loosely, gaze wandering over the lawn like he wasn't really listening. But then his eyes met mine again. Not just met, found, held. Something strange passed through me, almost like embarrassment. But not shame. More like awareness. The kind of thing you feel when someone sees something you weren't sure was visible. A version of yourself you'd long stopped presenting. My husband didn't notice. He rarely does. Not because he doesn't care. He does, in his own way. He checks the locks at night, makes sure I don't forget my vitamins, brings coffee to the shower if I'm running late. That kind of love. But he doesn't notice when I change perfumes. He doesn't notice the new lace that peeks beneath my neckline. He doesn't ask what I think about anymore. Not really. Our intimacy has become efficient, mechanical, good enough. And for a long time, I told myself good enough was the adult version of happiness. Later that night, back in our house, I undressed in the dark. He was already asleep, breathing slow and even. I moved quietly, slipping off my dress, pulling my bra straps down one at a time. I stood in the mirror for a moment, wearing only my underwear. Nothing extravagant, just clean, soft cotton. But I stared at myself as though I were trying to remember something I'd forgotten, or recognize something that had changed. The look he gave me earlier, it had stirred something. Not lust, not exactly. More like gravity. I felt drawn, pulled. Not by a person, but by the feeling of being seen as a woman, not a function. Not a wife, not a helper. A woman. I slipped into bed beside my husband, careful not to wake him. I laid there, eyes open, listening to the sound of his breath. Then I turned away, slowly, and pulled the blanket over my shoulder. I told myself, it didn't mean anything, but I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. The morning came heavy, not with regret, but with the sort of mental weight that makes even the simplest tasks feel deliberate. I moved through the kitchen quietly, trying not to clatter the plates as I set the table. The coffee was stronger than usual. I added more sugar to offset the bitterness, but still couldn't drink more than 2 sips. My husband sat across from me, immersed in an email on his phone. I watched his thumb scroll while the steam from my untouched cup curled into the air between us. He kissed my cheek before leaving. That same habitual peck he gave me every morning, efficient, almost polite. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a long moment, letting the silence settle around me like dust. The call from my mother came just after lunch. Her voice was tight, controlled, as she told me she wasn't feeling well, something with her blood pressure again. She'd already taken her pills, but the tremor in her voice pushed past the usual pleasantries. She didn't ask me to come. She never did. But I offered, instinctively. Or maybe I wanted an excuse. She lived about 40 minutes out of the city, in a modest one-story house surrounded by cypress trees. That drive had become routine over the years, a straight road bordered by power lines and uneven fences. But today it felt longer, slower. My foot hovered over the gas pedal more than once, my mind drifting. When I arrived, the house smelled of damp wood and ginger tea. My mother was curled under a knitted blanket on the sofa, colorless but alert. She insisted she was fine. I sat with her for a while, made her soup she didn't eat, and helped organize her medications. She drifted to sleep eventually, murmuring something about the mailman before slipping under. I cleaned up quietly and considered leaving, but I didn't. He was in the backyard, repairing the old gate that had been falling off, its hinges for years. The light caught the edge of his jaw as he stood, hands on his hips, evaluating the crooked frame. He turned when he heard me step outside. There was a pause, not tension, not awkwardness, something slower. Waited. "You staying the night?" he asked casually, wiping his hands on a towel he'd hooked into his waistband. I told him I hadn't decided. I lied. He nodded, not pressing further. His eyes didn't move away as quickly this time. He looked at me like a man who had already thought things through and was now just watching to see what I would do. Later, after dinner, plain rice and boiled vegetables that neither of us pretended to enjoy, my mother went to bed early. I washed the dishes. He dried them. Again. The routine, though simple, held a strange rhythm, as if the silence between us was not empty but charged with some slow-burning current. Our hands met over a glass. I dropped it and it didn't break. It bounced against the sink, landed on the sponge. I laughed a little louder than I should have. He smiled but didn't look away. I wanted to say something, anything, but I didn't. Instead, I walked outside, needing air I couldn't find in that kitchen. The porch light buzzed above me. I sat on the steps, pulling my sweater tighter around my arms. It wasn't cold, but my skin felt raw, my breath unsure. I heard the door creak, then his footsteps. He didn't sit. He just stood behind me. "You okay?" I nodded. He stepped down slowly, stopped beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off his side. He said nothing else. I didn't either. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. The air between us stretched thin. Then I turned to him. The was instinct. There was no moment of deliberation, no flicker of rational thought, just movement. My face turned toward him and his hand, wide, rough from work, lifted to brush the hair behind my ear. That touch shouldn't have mattered, but it did. I leaned forward, and he met me halfway. The kiss wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was stillness. Two people who had spent too long pretending they didn't need to feel. His lips were warm, familiar in a way that frightened me. It didn't last long, but it was enough. When we pulled apart, I didn't step back. I didn't look down in shame or retreat into apology. I simply looked at him, and he looked back like someone who already knew the cost of this and had decided it was worth it. I went inside before he did. My mother's door was closed, her hallway dark. I moved through the quiet like a thief, but nothing about me felt stolen. I slept in the guest room, beneath a quilt I hadn't seen since childhood. I lay on my back, eyes wide open, the taste of him still on my lips, the echo of his breath still lingering in my ears. I didn't touch my phone. I didn't text my husband goodnight, and when I closed my eyes, I didn't see my life. I saw his hands. I came back home 2 days later. The weather had turned gray, that flat, washed-out tone that made everything look bleached and tired. I unpacked in silence. My husband had left for work already, and the house felt sterile in his absence. Not empty, just disengaged. I moved through the room slowly, as if reacquainting myself with a space I'd never truly settled into. I noticed, with a dull pang of guilt, how untouched everything was. My perfume still sat, undisturbed, on the vanity. The slippers he had bought me for Christmas were exactly where I left them. The kitchen table was wiped clean, as if no one had eaten there at all. It felt like stepping into a hotel room you'd stayed in once but didn't quite remember. And yet, my heart beat like a signal fire beneath my ribs. Loud, erratic, too alive for such stillness. Later that afternoon, as I was organizing the laundry, I found something in my handbag. It wasn't mine. I would have noticed it immediately, if it had been. A small square object wrapped in plain brown paper. I unfolded it carefully, heart racing, a photo album. The cover was old, the edges soft with time. Inside, family pictures. Many I recognized: holidays, barbecues, graduation. I turned the pages slowly, but when I reached the middle, I froze. It was a photo from years ago. I must have been 19, maybe 20. We were all outside, a backyard party, and I was sitting at the edge of a picnic table laughing, head thrown back. He stood behind me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. Nothing inappropriate, nothing that would have seemed unusual to anyone else. But his eyes. Even in that frozen image, his eyes were on me, not the camera, not the group. Me. I stared at it for minutes, not because of what it showed, but because of what it stirred. A memory I had long since buried. The way I had flushed when he touched my shoulder that day, how I had adjusted my dress, how I hadn't looked at him afterward for the rest of the afternoon. I closed the album quickly, heart pounding. He had placed it in my bag deliberately. A message, an invitation, a warning. I didn't know. That evening, I stood in the shower much, longer than usual. The water was too hot, but I couldn't feel the burn. I watched it run down my arms, catching in the hollows of my elbows, twisting down in small, senseless spirals. I washed my body as if it were foreign, as if it belonged to someone else. When my husband came home, he greeted me with a kiss on the forehead. He asked how my mother was, what we ate, if she seemed better. I gave him the answers he wanted, calm, practiced. The truth now felt like something trapped in a sealed room I couldn't quite re-enter. We had dinner quietly. He spoke about a new project at work. The market was shifting again. He'd need to travel in 2 weeks. I nodded, feigned interest, gave all the expected responses. But my mind was somewhere else, on fingers brushing photo pages, on eyes behind the lens, on a mouth I had kissed without fear. Later, when we lay in bed, he reached for me. It wasn't rare, but it was never urgent. His affection came like ritual, slow, polite, detached. He kissed me the way one might sip lukewarm tea, gently, without expectation. His hands were careful, considerate, and I felt nothing. Not because I didn't care for him. I did, but not like that. Not anymore. The parts of me that had once stirred at his touch now waited elsewhere. My skin remembered someone else's breath. Still, I didn't stop him. That was the cruelest part. I let him continue because the alternative would have required a conversation I wasn't ready to have. Because I didn't know how to explain that being held didn't mean being seen. That my body no longer responded out of longing, but out of muscle memory. When it was over, he kissed my shoulder and whispered, "I miss this." I didn't respond. I lay still long after he drifted off, watching the ceiling, tracing cracks, in the plaster with my eyes like they might form some pattern, some answer. My phone buzzed once on the nightstand. I didn't need to check it to know who it was. Instead, I reached into the drawer and pulled out the photo album. I opened to the page again. His hand on my shoulder, my smile, that look in his eyes. I ran my finger over the photo, feeling the thin plastic resist under my nail. Some things, I realized, don't begin the moment you act on them. Some things begin the moment you allow yourself to remember. The next few days passed with mechanical precision. The clock dictated everything: when to wake, when to eat, when to say the right things, and when to pretend I didn't feel like I was standing on the edge of a precipice. Life, at least the version I had constructed so carefully, went on. I answered emails, watered the plants, returned a pair of slacks that didn't fit. I smiled at my husband when he mentioned Italy again. A possible trip, a rekindling. He'd said it with a hopeful lightness, but even his optimism felt rehearsed. I nodded and said we'd talk about it soon. We didn't. On Thursday morning, my mother called again. Her voice was flat but cordial. The paperwork for her pension had arrived, and she needed help filing a few documents online. Nothing urgent, she said. Nothing that couldn't wait. But her pauses between words felt slightly longer than necessary, as if she knew I needed a reason, or was giving me one. I told her I'd drive down after lunch. The drive was quiet, familiar. That same worn road, the same faded road signs. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't need noise. My thoughts were loud enough. My stepfather wasn't there when I arrived. I helped my mother with the documents, the usual tedium of bureaucracy, and stayed for coffee afterward, even though I wasn't in the mood for anything sweet. I asked about her blood pressure. She said it had stabilized. I asked if she was sleeping. She said not really. We talked around everything, but never through it. It wasn't until I stood up to leave that I heard the sound of his car in the gravel. My mother didn't react. She simply said, "He'll help you with the boxes in the shed," as if that had always been the plan. The boxes, of course, old kitchenware, some tools, a few boxes of my childhood books. He greeted me at the back door with a casual nod, as if we hadn't crossed a line I couldn't forget. He didn't speak when he led me around to the small storage shed near the fence. The late afternoon sun fell across the backyard in long, golden slants, painting everything in that surreal warmth that made you question whether what you were doing was wrong or just inevitable. The shed was dim and smelled of dust and wood rot. We didn't need to be in there. The boxes were minimal, light. The entire task could have been completed in minutes, but we didn't touch a thing. He turned, his body blocking the doorframe. The silence was unbearable, but neither of us moved. His arms were crossed. Mine hung at my sides. My heart felt too big for my chest. I took a step closer. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't seductive. It was just a single step, like I was trying to hear him better, though no one had spoken. Then finally, he did. "You've been different," he said, voice quiet. "Since last week?" I didn't deny it. I didn't pretend. I didn't even lower my eyes. He continued, his words careful, measured. I don't want to make this worse for you. I could feel his restraint like a pulse in the air. But beneath it, something more primal stirred. Not lust, not greed, just hunger. A need for contact, for recognition, for breath shared in a space that had long gone silent. I stepped again. Now only inches between us. I don't want to keep pretending, I said. My voice surprised even me, steady, unafraid. I had spent years mastering silence. But now, the words spilled too easily. He didn't answer. His hand reached out slowly as if testing the air. When his fingers grazed the side of my neck, everything else evaporated. I moved first. This kiss wasn't like the last. It was deliberate, confident. We knew what we were doing. It was slower, deeper. There was no shock this time, only acceptance. Our bodies found each other not with desperation but with clarity. His hands didn't tremble. Mine did. I don't know how long we stayed like that. The sun slipped further down the horizon. The air grew cooler, but the heat between us made it irrelevant. There were no words after, just breath. His thumb brushed the corner of my lip as if trying to erase the evidence, or maybe preserve it. We parted without drama. I didn't linger. I walked back into the house like nothing had happened, heart pounding so loud I was sure my mother could hear it through the walls. I said goodbye. She hugged me longer than usual. Did she know? I didn't ask. I couldn't. The drive back was darker this time, though the sky was clear. When I got home, the lights were on. My husband had cooked pasta and garlic bread, his version of romantic effort. He poured wine, asked about my mother's paperwork, made a joke about old computers and older government systems. I smiled, nodded, played my part. After dinner, he reached for my hand across the table. "You've been quiet lately," he said. "Everything okay?" I met his eyes. I tried to search for something I hadn't seen in years, a flicker of urgency, of presence. But there was only concern, mild, sweet concern. "I'm just tired," I replied. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. That night, I lay in bed in silence again. Not restless, not guilty. Just waiting. For what? I wasn't sure. But I knew this wasn't the end, it was the middle. Sometimes it's not a decision. It's a drift. You don't wake up one day and say, "I'm going to destroy the only life I've ever built." You just start moving, molecule by molecule, into another version of yourself. Until one day you find your body in a room you never meant to enter, your hand reaching for a door you don't remember opening. It was a week later when my husband suggested we have his parents over for dinner. I agreed without thinking. The idea of family, of formality, felt like armor, structure, something that might slow whatever was happening inside me. I spent the afternoon preparing, roasting vegetables, setting the table with cloth napkins, polishing the wine glasses we only used for company. I wore a navy blouse he liked, soft at the collarbone, and a pale nude lipstick that matched nothing but still made me feel tidy. And yet, while my hands moved with the rhythm of habit, my mind moved elsewhere. I had seen him again, my stepfather, earlier that week. Not alone, not long. Just a brief encounter when I'd dropped off a form my mother had forgotten to submit. He had opened the door, nodded in thanks, but his hand had brushed mine, again as he took the envelope. That was all. A breath. A flicker. And still, my body hadn't recovered from it. Dinner was pleasant in the way that rehearsed moments often are. His parents complimented the food, asked about Italy, discussed their neighbor's new landscaping project as if it were state news. My husband was charming, proud, almost performative, smiling at me as though we were still some image he wanted to frame. They left around 10. The house grew quiet. I began to collect plates, stacking them in slow, even piles. He took a bottle of wine and poured 2 more glasses. "We did well," he said, lifting his in a small toast. I gave a tight smile and sat beside him on the couch. The cushions sank slightly between us. The wine tasted too sweet. He shifted closer. His arm slid along the back of the couch, brushing my shoulder. "You look tired," he murmured, leaning in. "I am," I answered. I didn't elaborate. He took the glass from my hand, set it down carefully. Then he kissed me, not out of routine this time, but with effort. I knew he wanted to connect, to reach me. And for a flicker of a moment, I tried to let him. But it wasn't there. His hands wandered, searching, remembering old paths across my skin. My body, out of memory and guilt, responded with polite compliance. But inside, it felt as if I were watching it all from across the room, like the moment was happening to someone who resembled me, but wasn't me. He whispered something. My name, a compliment, a question. I didn't register it. I nodded reflexively. Let him lead me upstairs. Let him remove my blouse as if we were undressing decades of silence. The lights stayed off. That helped. When it ended, he held me close. His breath was soft against my neck. Like old times, he whispered. I closed my eyes. And then, as if fate needed to remind me what I was, the phone buzzed. Just once. Not enough to demand attention, but enough to pull me back. He was asleep. I slipped out of his arms and padded quietly. Downstairs, the floor cold beneath my bare feet. I checked the phone, one message, no words, just an address, and a time, tomorrow. 3 p.m., no context, no signature, but I knew he wanted to see me. The room in the hotel wasn't far, an older place, discreet, mostly used by businessmen traveling through town. I told my husband I was meeting a friend from university for coffee. He didn't question it. He rarely questioned anything. I arrived early. My fingers shook as I buttoned the blouse I had ironed 3 times, underneath a new set of lingerie, not extravagant, just different. A soft black lace that lay against my skin like permission. I sat in the room for 10 minutes before he arrived, staring at the ceiling, counting each flicker of doubt as it passed and dissolved. When he walked in, he didn't smile. He didn't speak. He closed the door and stood there, as if waiting. To see whether I would move first, I did. There were no questions. No explanations, just gravity. His arms around me, my hands at his shoulders. The kiss came like a slow collapse. No hunger, no violence, just need. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't even tender. It was raw. It was precise. Our mouths met, and I felt his breath fill the empty places I had been ignoring for years. His hands found my hips. Mine found his jaw. The fabric between us felt like a crime. We stopped just short. The edge, the line. I pulled back first, breathless, eyes locked on his. We can't, I said. But my voice betrayed me. I didn't believe my own words. I know, he replied. But he didn't move. We stood like that, forehead to forehead, a silence more intimate than anything I had known in years. I left 10 minutes later, alone, hair undone, buttons misaligned, my heart a drumbeat I couldn't silence. That night, I sat across from my husband again. He talked about airfare, Venice, the Grand Canal. I smiled, but I was already drowning. I woke up the next morning with the weight of a double, life settling into the pit of my stomach like spoiled fruit. Not from guilt, not entirely. It was more the realization that I had crossed an invisible threshold, and now I was walking in a version of my own life I no longer fully recognized. One that wore my clothes, spoke with my voice, but moved with a hunger I had long ago buried beneath politeness, loyalty, and the ordinary choreography of being a wife. The days that followed blurred into one another, a rhythm of rehearsed domesticity, masking the turmoil unfolding inside me. I cooked dinner. I folded laundry. I asked my husband how work was going and nodded at his answers even when I couldn't hear a word. I replied to emails with forced cheer, returned calls, scheduled a dental cleaning, wiped down the bathroom mirror. But the quiet moments between these tasks, the seconds spent staring too long out the window, the pauses over the kitchen sink, were now filled with images I could no longer suppress. The heat of a forehead pressed to mine, fingers tangled at my waist. The taste of certainty, too real to mistake for curiosity. He didn't message again, and yet his silence wasn't absence. It was presence in its most punishing form. It haunted me in the subtlest ways, in the way I second-guessed every tone, in my husband's voice, in the way I hesitated before answering benign questions, in the way my body stiffened when he kissed my cheek too softly, too familiarly. One night, my husband came home later than usual. He tossed his keys onto the counter, poured himself a drink, and sat at the dining table, loosening his tie like it had betrayed him. I watched him from across the kitchen, a dish rag in hand, the smell of sautéed onions still hanging in the air. "I've been thinking," he said after a long pause, not looking up. "Maybe we should go somewhere, just us. It's been too long," I nodded, said we could look at flights. He smiled faintly and sipped his whiskey. But the idea of going away with him, being alone together, in some curated setting where expectation would hover between us like a third presence, filled me with a quiet dread I couldn't name. I didn't want more space for us. I wanted more silence, more distance. That same week, I ran into my mother at the grocery store. We weren't meant to see each other. I had stopped in for olive oil and coffee filters. She was there for ginger and oranges. We almost collided near the bread aisle. She hugged me too tightly, the way she always did when she didn't want to ask something directly. "You've lost weight," she said, her tone casual but careful. "Stress," I replied, which wasn't a lie. She studied me. "You sure everything's okay?" I nodded, smiled, changed the subject. But I knew she saw through me. Mothers always do. Back at home, I sat in the car for 15 minutes before going inside. The windows fogged slightly, the air turning damp. I could hear the sound of my own breath, how shallow it had become. The moment I walked through the door, my husband called from the living room. He was on the phone with his mother, laughing about something she'd said. When he saw me, he gestured to wait. He'd be off in a minute. I stood there, groceries in my hand, watching him laugh, watching the ease in his posture, the familiarity of it. I knew that laugh. I had once been its source. Now it felt borrowed. That night, I tried to write in my journal, a habit I'd abandoned years ago, now resurrected as a way to give shape to the mess inside me. But the words wouldn't come. My pen hovered over the page while my mind swirled in fragments. I wanted him to call. My stepfather. I wanted him to undo the quiet between us, to shatter it, to remind me that this ache wasn't one-sided, that what had happened between us hadn't been imagined or indulged, but real. I wanted confirmation, not love, not possession, just proof that I wasn't spiraling alone, but there was nothing, just silence. It wasn't until 3 days later that he called, a simple ringtone, a name I didn't save but couldn't forget. I stepped outside to answer it, barefoot on the porch, the night air clinging to my skin like damp wool. His voice was low, measured. I shouldn't have asked you to come that day. I leaned against the railing. You didn't ask. He paused. It won't happen again. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The air between us pulsed with everything unsaid. I mean it, he added. This isn't fair to you, or to her. I felt the words like small punctures, slow and exact. I'm not asking for anything, I finally said. But you want it? He replied. Silence. You're not the only one, he added quietly. But that doesn't make it right. I closed my eyes. My throat tightened. When the call ended, I stood there for a long time. The street was quiet. A neighbor's porch light flickered off. Somewhere, far away, a dog barked twice. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the phone. I went back inside. The lights were dim. The air smelled of detergent and lemon. My husband was asleep on the couch, the TV still murmuring low. I sat beside him and turned off the screen. The quiet settled over us like a blanket. I tucked it in. Weeks don't leave. They settle in. They don't vanish into the past. They layer themselves over your skin like old wallpaper, impossible to peel away without tearing something underneath. I realized that the morning I reached for a scarf I hadn't worn in months and caught a faint trace of his scent, not perfume, not cologne, just something vague and warm and stored in the fibers. He had adjusted it for me once, during that drive. A simple, practical gesture. But in the quiet that followed, my body had already shifted in a way I never came back from. Husband was speaking more often now about Italy. Venice, specifically. He brought it up with a kind of practiced cheer, as if the repetition itself might wear down my reluctance. We need this, he said one night while we folded laundry, placing each item neatly into piles that never mixed. I nodded, offered a non-committal smile. He didn't press. He was never the type to argue. He asked, and when he didn't get the answer he wanted, he simply waited, assuming it would come eventually. But nothing in me felt like waiting anymore. The house began to feel smaller, not suffocating, just closer, like it was folding in on itself. The walls seemed more aware. I noticed things I hadn't in years. The hairline crack in the hallway mirror, the uneven squeak in the third stair, the discoloration on the ceiling above the shower. I walked through it all like someone touring a former life, touching surfaces out of obligation rather than comfort. Then one evening, the silence broke, and not in the way I expected. Our son came home for a weekend visit. He was taller than I remembered, more composed, like something in the outside world had polished him at the edges. He hugged me tightly, held on a moment longer than usual. We sat on the patio that afternoon. The sun was still soft, and I had just brewed coffee. The clink of his spoon in the cup was the only sound for a moment before he looked up and said, not accusingly but with gentle curiosity, "You seem different lately. Is everything okay?" It took me a second too long to answer. "I'm fine," I said and tried to smile. He didn't push, but he didn't believe me. "You look lighter," he said, almost as if it were a compliment. "It's not Dad, is it?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, took a sip, then added, "You just don't look at him the way you used to. It's not bad, just different." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because he was right, and I didn't know how he saw it, or how I had failed to hide it. Maybe we always think we're better at performing than we are. That night, I couldn't sleep. My husband had already drifted off, his breathing steady, arm draped across my waist like a placeholder. I lay staring at the ceiling, feeling the phantom of my son's words settling in my chest. I got out of bed quietly and walked into the living room, letting the darkness hold me for a while. I hadn't heard from him, not since the call, but I thought of him constantly, not just his face or his hands or the press of his lips. I thought of the way he paused before speaking, of how he watched me like I was a story he hadn't finished reading. I thought of the steadiness in his silence, how it made me feel seen in a way that didn't demand anything in return. At 2:14 a.m., I sent him a message. I don't want this to disappear like it never happened. No reply. Not then. The next morning, I woke up to find a note on the counter. From my husband. I've booked the flights. We leave in 2 weeks. I hope this helps. He had drawn a small smiley face at the bottom, a habit he picked up early in our marriage. Back when such gestures made me laugh, I stared at it longer than I should have. By noon, my phone buzzed. A message. From him. It was a single sentence. Can we see each other? Just once. No promises. No plans. Just truth. I didn't answer immediately. I sat with it, turned it over in my head, let it vibrate through every inch of my body that still remembered what truth had felt like between us. Then quietly, I packed a bag. Not for Italy, for him. I didn't lie. Not this time. I didn't invent errands or name friends I hadn't seen in years. I didn't choreograph an excuse or rehearse my tone in the mirror. I simply said I needed a day, time for myself. And my husband, bless his trust, didn't press. He kissed my forehead, told me to take as long as I needed, and left for the office with the ease of a man who believes routine is safety. But there was no safety left in my routine. Only a growing crack running through the center of my carefully constructed life. The bag I packed was small, just enough. Not symbolic, not strategic, just practical. A change of clothes, a toothbrush. The kind of essentials one packs when they don't know what to expect but can't stay still any longer. As I zipped it shut, I thought of how many times I had folded his shirts, how many times I had stacked socks into neat pairs, and yet here I was, moving with trembling fingers through my own belongings, not knowing who I was doing this for. Him, my husband, or the version of me that had quietly died somewhere between last fall and now. The address he sent wasn't a hotel this time. It was a house, a rented cottage on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by tall hedges and gravel paths. Remote, but not hidden. Modest, almost disappointingly normal. I parked at the end of the driveway and sat in the car longer than necessary. My palms were damp against the steering wheel. When I finally stepped out, the door opened before I could knock. He was there, no smile, no greeting, just eyes that looked heavier than I remembered. He stepped aside wordlessly to let me in. The inside was simple. Wooden floors, soft, filtered light, a faint smell of cedar and something older, something like paper or tobacco. The kind of place that feels unfinished, like it exists only for what's meant to happen inside, not for what surrounds it. We stood in the kitchen first, neither of us moving. The silence wasn't heavy this time. It was fragile, like if either of us spoke too soon, the moment would shatter. He broke it with a single phrase. I didn't think you'd come. And I answered the only way I could. I couldn't not. It was a strange relief to be out of pretending, to stand in front of someone who didn't need me to wear the face I'd worn for years. I watched his chest rise and fall. I watched his hands clench slightly, then release. We didn't move toward each other. We didn't collapse into a kiss or fall into bed. This wasn't that kind of recklessness. This was something slower, something deeper. We sat on opposite sides of the couch. The air between us buzzed with everything that had been building for weeks, months, maybe longer. He looked at me carefully, like he was trying to memorize me in real time. I've never wanted to hurt anyone, he said. I know, I whispered. But I've wanted you, he added, quieter this time. I still do. My own words startled me. Not because they were untrue, but because they came so easily. No shame, no hesitation. Just need. Stripped of performance, ceremony, guilt. I reached for him first. Not out of impulse, but clarity. When his hand met mine, the tension that had lived between us melted without force. He leaned in slowly, as if waiting for me to change my mind. I didn't. The kiss was unlike the others. There was no search in it now, no hesitation. It was full and anchored. His mouth against mine was deliberate. And when he pulled back, I felt his breath on my cheek like a reminder that I was still alive in ways I hadn't been in years. We didn't speak again for a while. He laid his hand against my thigh, not possessively, but with the weight of someone who had been waiting too long to touch something real. I leaned into him. We sat like that for what felt like hours. Later, as the sun dipped lower and the shadows thickened across the floor, he walked me to the back garden. It was small and overgrown, a square of green fenced by ivy and thyme. I stepped out barefoot into the grass, the soil damp and cold beneath my feet. He watched me from the doorway. What are we doing? I asked finally. The question hung between us like a curtain. He exhaled, slow and deep. Something we'll never forget. It wasn't an answer, but it was true. I didn't sleep there. I didn't need to. What had passed between us didn't demand permanence. It demanded presence. When I returned home, the sky was already dark. The house was still. My husband had fallen asleep on the couch, again the television flickering across his face in muted tones. I stood at the doorway, watching him breathe, and for the first time, I realized it wasn't a question of who I loved. It was a question of who made me feel like I existed. I've always believed that endings don't announce themselves. They slip in sideways, disguised as something familiar. A conversation, a silence, a question that hangs too long. The ending had been coming for months, maybe years, though I didn't see it until it stood quietly at my kitchen table on a Thursday morning while I poured coffee I no longer drank. My husband sat across from me, his tie already knotted, his fingers absently scrolling through a news article he wouldn't remember. I watched him for a long time before speaking. Maybe I hoped he would look up first, notice something, sense something, but he didn't. When he finally did glance at me, it wasn't because he felt a shift, it was just habit. I thought we could finalize the itinerary tonight, he said. For Venice. I moved some meetings. You'll love the hotel. I nodded slowly, took a sip, lukewarm, bitter. My reflection in the kitchen window looked older than I remembered, or maybe just different. He continued talking. Museums, weather, forecasts, a list of restaurants he'd saved. He was trying. I could see it in the precision of his words, in the way he laid out each detail like an offering. He wanted to restore something, preserve what he thought was still salvageable. But love doesn't decay in a straight line. It corrodes quietly, often unnoticed, until one day you wake up and realize the touch you once craved now feels like a courtesy. I interrupted him mid-sentence. Did you ever notice? I asked. That I stopped laughing when you touched me? His eyes blinked in confusion, not understanding. Not yet. What do you mean? I mean, somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling it. Your hands, your voice, the way you say my name. He set the phone down slowly. The silence that followed was not defensive. It was hollow. He was searching for a response, one that wouldn't reveal what he already suspected. I thought things were just tense lately. That's why I planned the trip. I nodded. I know, and I appreciate that. But this isn't a tension. It's a vacancy. He looked down, fingers tightening around the coffee mug. You're seeing someone, he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because there was no version of it that would make him hurt less. After a long pause, I said, I felt more like myself with him than I have in years. He looked up. His face didn't change, not immediately, but his shoulders dropped slightly, like the breath he'd been holding finally gave out. I don't know who that makes me, he said softly. You're still you, I replied. You're just not mine anymore. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He didn't even ask who. He just sat there, staring at the wall, as if trying to memorize a life he no longer belonged to. When he finally spoke again, his voice was so quiet it barely reached across the table. How long? Not long, I said, but long enough. There was nothing left to explain. No fight to be had. The war had already been waged, silently, across years of misread glances and dismissed. Longing, I left the kitchen before he did, packed a small bag again, this time not hidden, not secret. As I closed the zipper, I looked around the bedroom we had shared for over a decade, the bed still slightly rumpled from the night before, the framed photo on the dresser from a beach trip in better days. I stared at it for a moment. The woman smiling in that picture looked like someone I used to know. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't grieving, but because I had already done the mourning quietly, in pieces, across too many nights alone inside a shared life. I left before lunch. He didn't follow. Outside, the world looked unremarkable. No thunderstorm, no dramatic soundtrack. Just an ordinary Thursday where everything had changed. I didn't go to him, not immediately. I drove nowhere for a while. Let the road decide. Let the wind fill in the spaces I couldn't yet name. Eventually, I pulled over, somewhere quiet. I turned off the engine, let my hand rest on the steering wheel as the silence settled around me. Then I reached for my phone. One message, just 2 words. Are you okay? I stared at it, then typed back, slowly, deliberately. Not yet, but I will be. And for the first time in years, I knew it was true.